The heat of the summer bore down on the fields of the eastern Iranian plateau. Here, on this hot, blistering summer's day, two empires would clash. Men from as far as Serbia in the west, to Turkmen from Anatolia, Azerbaijan and Khorasan, Afghans and Georgians, Kurds and Armenians, men from around the known world swelled the ranks of both armies. All in all, 150,000 men had gathered there on the green and brown fields of eastern Anatolia. At the time, three Islamic superpowers dominated much of what is now the Balkans, Anatolia, the Iranian plateau, Afghanistan, Levant, and Mesopotamia. First and for a long time foremost were the Mamluk Sultanate, defeaters of both the Mongols and the Crusaders. They were the anointed sovereigns of Cairo, Mecca, and Medina. These slave-come sultans ruled as preeminent powerhouses in both the Mediterranean and the Arabian Sea. Also known as the Devlet al-Turkiye, or State of the Turks, the Mamluks were controlling trade and wealth of the region and beyond. In 1393, the Ottoman ruler Bayezid I gave audience to the Mamluk emissary Amir Husam in the Ottoman capital of Bursa, an ancient city in the north of western Anatolia that flourished under Ottoman rule, yet paled in comparison to the Mamluk imperial capital of Cairo. According to the Mamluk sources, while accepting the gifts sent by the Mamluk Sultan Barkuk, Bayezid commented that he was Barkuk's slave or Mamluk himself. With this exaggerated expression, Bayezid did not display false humility, but instead acknowledged his inferior political status. Despite his rapid expansion into the Balkans and through western and central Anatolia, the Ottoman sovereign was not yet the equivalent of his Mamluk counterpart, who ruled a prestigious regime that had dominated the central Islamic lands since the 1250s. Bayezid's predecessors had merely established themselves as vassals of first the Anatolian Seljuks and then of the Mongol Ilkhanids in northwestern Anatolia, which existed as a frontier territory squeezed between the borders of the Bayezid Empire and multiple local Muslim magnates. By the time of Bayezid II and Selim, the Mamluks had been severely weakened. The Black Death repeatedly returned, and Egypt was affected 58 times between 1347 and 1517. The depopulation resulted in lower income taxes, and the irrigation system was not maintained and collapsed, resulting in less agriculture and therefore less growth. The disruption in the monopoly of the spice trade, as well as the attacks from the Portuguese and the plagues, forced the Mamluks to seek Ottoman support. Though they were able to enforce the rule in their realm and the realm of the neighboring Turkmens to submit to their rule, the rise of Ismail Shah would be the final nail in their coffin. Second of these mighty empires of the time are the Ottomans themselves. Since the 13th century, due to various reasons not limited to a location most beneficial for its development, being far enough from centralized Seljuk rule, and close enough to the Christian realms that a steady supply of Ghazis was available, the Ottomans were able to carve out an empire that would be more pragmatism and tenacity allowed the Ottomans to build a multicultural, multi-ethnic state built on the bones of the old Byzantine system. Coupled with Turkic and Islamic flavor, made them the most preeminent power in not only the Mediterranean, but in Eastern Europe as well. They too had defeated the Crusaders. Had they not earned as much prestige as the Mamluks? Were they not worthy of being the successors to the Romans? Were they not worthy of being caliphs? Bayezid II, Sultan Selim's father, hosted another Mamluk ambassador in Turkey, a plain near the previous Ottoman capital of Edirne. Both the city and its green surroundings offered Bayezid a haven from the political intrigues and frequent plague epidemics in Constantinople, the former Byzantine imperial center and the Ottoman capital since 1453. This ambassadorial audience, who took place in 1485, illustrates a radically different balance of power between the Ottoman and Mamluk rulers than the one in 1393. The Mamluk ambassador Amir Janibak, who arrived during a pause in the Ottoman-Mamluk War that had begun in the spring of 1484, attempted to mend relations between the two courts. He was hosted honorably and properly during his stay, but he quickly understood there was little hope for him to complete his mission. An unidentified person in the Ottoman audience asked Janibak, "Who are you to rule over the holy cities, you sons of infidels? This rule is more proper for our Sultan, since he is a son of sultans and sultans." Even more telling was the fact that during his entire exchange, Bayezid did not utter a single word to his visitors. Much had changed since the days of Bayezid I, who had declared his subservience to the Mamluk Sultan, like many rulers from Delhi to Edirne. Soon after the Mamluk envoys returned to Cairo, military conflict between the two powers resumed. In a single generation, the Ottomans transformed from a European power with little to no intent in the Islamic world to a continent-spanning behemoth. But the Ottomans had a more dangerous foe growing in the east, the Safavids. The origin of the Safavids, as well as their Mamluks, we will go into detail in later videos. They are a militant order, founded by a scholar named Sheikh Safi al-Din, whose followers were originally Sunni. The order's identity changed to a more militant ideology with the arrival of Turkic tribesmen, and with the view of divinity in their leaders, they became a 12 Shia order, as opposed to most of the Muslim world. The major differences taking place in the Islamic world was over a spiritual versus legal aspect of the religion. Conformity with standards of practicing Islam versus personal direct interaction with Allah. On one spectrum, the Sharia, and on the other, Sufism. Sunnis and Shia did not particularly fall or map into this axis, and there were a whole lot of Muslims who did not follow a particular order or Sharia legal school. However, no matter the differences between a nomadic Sufi or a palace-dwelling legalist, a Khan's legal scholar or a Sufi teacher at a major city, there were some beliefs that were considered extreme, gulu, if you will, and their followers as gulat, meaning exaggerators, literalists, and those who take things too far. By the 1450s, the order had turned from a traditional one to that of a semi-political entity. Thousands of Turkoman tribesmen in what is now eastern Turkey and Azerbaijan had become adherents, from the lowliest herders to viziers and nobles in the Ilkhanate themselves. Gold and riches flocked to their capital in Ardabil, and by a time of Sheikh Junaid, they had become calling themselves Sultan, which was more of a political title and not a religious one. This had greatly angered the Karakoyunlu, who then expelled their order from Ardabil by decree. It was then that Junaid had settled with the Akkoyunlu. The Akkoyunlu leader Uzun Hasan, a long-term enemy of the Ottomans, who married his sister to Junaid. It was during this time that the order had developed some of their really unorthodox views, even naming his son Haidar as Mahdi, the 12th Imam, as per their now 12er views. This is what made them Gulat. Even though many followed them, their messianic views were very much outside Islamic tradition. In the 15th century, when the spiritual Grand Master of the movement of the Safavid order, Sheikh Haidar, the head of the Safaviya Sufi order, organized his followers into militant troops, the Qizilbash, a derisive term set by the Ottomans, which they wore with pride. Haidar also married a Byzantine princess, effectively weaving his descendants. Haidar also married a Byzantine princess, effectively weaving his descendants into the highest political spheres of the time. The Qizilbash, redheads based on their 12-pointed hats, made up the strong elite of Ismail's army, held a strong presence across Anatolia from the late 15th century to the mid-16th century. Due to their fluid religious character of the region at the time, the primary Sunni Ottoman state demonstrated a notable tolerance towards Shia Islam and a Safavid adherents, treating them mainly as another Sufi order. However, beginning in the early 16th century, this tolerance began to recede. According to the official Ottoman terminology from the period, a Qizilbash was a rebel heretic, suspected of illicit relationships with the Safavids. Some ascribe this receding tolerance to the decline of the Akkoyunlu, coupled with the emerging socio-political legitimacy of the Safavid Empire and Ismail Shah. 3 years earlier, under the reign of Selim's father, Bayezid II, before his disastrous defeat in Chaldiran, Ismail Shah, as Shah of Iran, has supported a brutal uprising in the Ottoman lands, the Shah Kula Rebellion. Though the revolt was incited by the Shah Kula among the Qizilbash, numbering among the eventual participants were various non-Qizilbash groups, such as former Sipahis, dispossessed Ghazis, and other Turkmen peoples. This increase in tolerance contributed in part to the malcontent of the Turkoman tribes in Anatolia towards the Ottoman state. Their refusal to pay taxes, settle down, and accept Ottoman central control pushed these Turkoman tribes towards a militant form of Shiism. The solidification of these lands under a state for the Ottomans had created an easy target for the new men of the Safavid regime. This same malcontent would lead to multiple uprisings in East Anatolia, headed by tribal leaders. All the Anatolian lands were in turmoil. Many nomads who had saturated the land did not love any centralized control. Sure, they would fight for the Ottomans. They would fight for fame and fortune, but if they wanted to, they could leave. In addition, Bayezid was not able in controlling these tensions. Though the rebellion was eventually put down, it led to an incursion. It showed that the Ottomans were vulnerable to the same Ghazi mentality and valor of the human capital that was the Turkmen tribes. The reign of Bayezid II, the Pious, gave the army much needed time to rest, rehabilitate, and reorganize. A succession crisis forced him to appease his European enemies, and except for raids and occasional small border conflicts, the Hungarian and Venetian borders remained calm and stable. Bayezid tried to keep clear of the Safavids in Iran and the drastic socio-political developments taking place in eastern Anatolia. Focusing on other fronts, he undertook two limited but problematic campaigns against the Moldavians and the Mamluks. The Moldavian, or in Turkish the Bogdan campaign, was a risky undertaking from the very beginning. The army rank and file vividly remember the disastrous campaign of 1475, in which the expeditionary forces were decimated, as well as the problematic victory of 1476. Moldavia, because of its geography and terrain features, was not a viable country for the Ottoman military to conduct its classical combat techniques or effectively use its cannons. The enemy preferred to fight unconventionally and skillfully made use of forests and marshlands instead of facing Ottomans in the conventional battles. There was no large city from which its capture might force the enemy to surrender. Moreover, the Ottomans went into the barren, trackless country with extremely limited resources and without the support of their famous logistical network. Bayezid launched the Moldavian campaign in 1484 in order to satisfy the standing military units, especially the Janissaries, which were frustrated by a prolonged absence of military activity. Ottoman expeditionary forces easily passed through Wallachia, or Eflak in Turkish, but immediately began to suffer problems in the inhospitable environment of Moldavia. Although it was a limited undertaking, The Ottomans had the support of a large Crimean Tatar contingent. The lessons learned in the previous campaigns paid off, and in contrast to the previous campaigns, they did not try to search for the Moldavian army, but focused on the coastal fortifications of Chilia and Akirman. Both of these were captured after brief siege operations of 9 and 12 days respectively. These two fortresses would become very important for safeguarding Ottoman interests in the northern Black Sea region. In the short term, however, the undefeated Moldavians preserved their military potential and continued to create problems. Their later attacks on Ottoman units and allies provoked two limited campaigns, again in 1485 and 1486. Bayezid's other campaign, the campaigns against the Mamluks, were inescapable due to the imperial interests of the Ottoman Empire and the collapse of the buffer states between them and the Mamluks. After a brief period of border conflict, Bayezid decided to force the Mamluks out of southern Anatolia. The Ottoman expeditionary force, which mainly consisted of provincial units, that was sent there easily conquered Cilicia in 1485. However, overconfident Ottoman commanders were later caught unprepared and severely defeated in Adana on February 9, 1486. Bayezid responded by ordering another limited campaign, with a small detachment of his personal janissaries to support the provincial units. This campaign also ended with a humiliating defeat at the Second Battle of Adana in March 15, 1486. The soldiers from the Karamad province fled without fighting, forcing all Ottomans to retreat. Interestingly, the Mamluks also retreated at the same time, but to an area close to the battlefield. They hurriedly returned and claimed both field and victory. As it retreated, Turkoman tribes attacked the disorganized Ottoman army in the mountains, and it suffered more casualties. In addition to the piecemeal and escalatory Ottoman approach to the conflict, a mixture of structural, loyalty, and command and control problems were the main reasons behind the Ottoman series of defeats of a military weaker state. The Ottoman army was accustomed to centralized battle command of the Sultan himself or his Grand Vizier, but instead, Bayezid remained in the capital and handed over command to one of his junior governors without clear instructions. During the conduct of all three campaigns, Bayezid's governors became involved in personal disputes and sabotaged each other. Some Ottoman units also turned out to be disloyal and not capable of standing in the line of battle. In addition to the men from Karaman, the Anatolian Sipahis as a whole were unhappy with the increased centralization of the state, and their reduced status in accordance with the standing army, and were reluctant to fight hard. Additionally, some soldiers were affected by Shia propaganda of Iran, and their loyalty to the empire became controversial. Their half-hearted participation was evident during these campaigns, especially the disloyalty and treachery of the Karaman Sipahis. These two problems were temporary issues, and Bayezid's successor, Selim I, Yavuz Sultan Selim, overcame them in time. However, the structural problem of fighting against nomadic cavalry was more daunting and remained. The Mamluks were the finest nomadic cavalry of the day and enjoyed a conventional military capability as well. As already mentioned, the Ottoman military, like all other conventional armies, did not like to fight against nomadic cavalry. Surprisingly, the nomadic origins of the Ottomans did not help them and in some ways became a liability. Obviously, any nomadic enemy, naive enough to face the Ottoman army in pitched battle, had a limited chance of success. Because the Ottoman professional infantry and firepower would pin the cavalry, allowing it no opportunity to escape. Nevertheless, against all odds, the Mamluks engaged in 3 pitched battles and defeated the Ottoman army in every case. These results happened in the first 2 battles because the Ottomans were neither ready to face nomadic cavalry, nor were they able to apply their classical light cavalry and infantry combined operations properly due to the lack of standing infantry units. In the 3rd battle, loyalty problems by provincial troops ensured the Ottoman defeat. This structural problem of engaging nomadic cavalry was already known to the Ottoman High Command from its experience in the Battle of Ankara against Timur and more recently from the Otluk-Beyli Battle of 1473. In the Otluk-Beyli campaign, Ak Koyunlu nomadic cavalry wiped out the entire Ottoman vanguard after luring them into an ambush before the battle. However, the Ottoman army managed to defeat the Ak Koyunlu troops decisively because of two factors. The mobilization of personal and logistical capacity was performed efficiently, and the units of Selim's army joined the main army in two large concentration areas. After concentration, the Ottoman expeditionary force of Sultan Selim covered 2,445 kilometers in 123 days, mostly in good order. In addition to the auxiliary combat service support units, thousands of civilians and packed animals were mobilized. Contemporary Ottoman sources mentioned the mobilization of 20,000 camels. The Ottoman Navy undertook important logistical responsibilities by ferrying provisions to the Trabzon harbor. As the campaign progressed, Shah Ismail of the Safavids followed a scorched earth strategy by moving civilians and destroying everything of value on the Ottoman avenue of advance. For this reason, the careful logistical planning, large-scale mobilization, and coordination effort barely met the needs of the army in such inhospitable and ravaged territory. Selim made use of financial awards effectively to motivate soldiers from the very beginning. He allocated units from the interior security and strategic reserves. These measures turned out to be a wise decision because the disaffected Akıncıs and Anatolian Sipahis were already infected by Shiite propaganda and did not willingly want to fight against them. Additionally, the harsh conditions of the campaign caused immense suffering at the level of the individual soldier. Moreover, Selim had to deal with two serious janissary disorders. When the Iranian army's presence was discovered at the Chaldiran field, Selim immediately decided to attack. Surprisingly, Shah Ismail decided to face the Ottomans in a pitched battle, even though most of his Turkoman commanders preferred traditional nomadic tactics. He made the mistake of underestimating the real capacity of the Ottoman military machine due to its poor performance against the Mamluks. He had no idea about the effects of firearms. Selim employed the classical Ottoman battle formation with minor alterations, by which he placed artillery in front of both flanks in addition to the cannons in the center. At first, Selim ordered the hills in the southwest of the plains to be captured, so that the army could easily turn its back to the mountains. Thereupon, the Charkar Suvari, or the vanguard units, under the command of Orhan Bey, soon captured these hills. Selim I would command the center, and next to him would be the Kazakhed Grand Vizier Hersekzade Ahmet Pasha, and Dukaginoğlu Ahmet Pasha, and Mustafa Pasha from the Viziers. The right flank consisted of Anatolian soldiers. As per the Anatolian campaign formation, they would be commanded by the Anatolian governor Hadim Sinan Pasha and the Karaman Beylerbeyi Zeynel Pasha. The Rumeli Beylerbeyi Hasan Pasha would command the left flank, which consisted of Rumelian soldiers. Then the Azaps of Anatolia and Rumelia would be in the most dangerous place of the army, in front of these cannons. The number of these cannons were about 500, and they were placed on the most dominant hills. Ismail Shah's army would not be able to notice the hidden cannons at first glance, and would be hidden behind the Azaps, which were in front of the cannons. At the time, the Azaps would open way for the cannons with a masterful maneuver and would take the Safavid army in a ring of cannon fire. Shah Ismail, on the other hand, was commanding the right flank of his army. The governor of Diyarbakir, Ustacıoğlu Mehmehan, and Grand Vizier Mir Abdülbaki commanded the left flank. The Shah was counting on a magnificent victory as his armored cavalry prevailed over the Ottomans. When the battle started, The Ottoman janissaries used very heavy rifles, which they were called the fitili musquet, or the thundering irons, for the first time in this war. With the firing of rifles, breaches began to open in the Safavid army. Seeing that his army was faltering, Shah Ismail charged the Ottoman left flank with his right flank under his command. The Azabs in the left flank could not implement this Yavuz's strategy, and they could not sit aside and allow the cannons to fire on Ismail Shah. Tired and exhausted, Rumelian soldiers were insufficient against the vigorous forces of Shah Ismail. Shah Ismail during the charge was able to slay Rumeli Bey Hassan Pasha. Yavuz Sultan Selim was quick to realize the situation. While mobilizing his artillery on one hand, he blocked Shah Ismail's return path with select janissaries on the other. Even though the left flank was destroyed, Yavuz, who commanded the center, and Hadim Pasha, who commanded the right flank, were able in putting the Safavid army in difficult situations. The Azabs retreated behind the cannons and began shooting on the right flanks. The Azabs on the right flanks were able to execute the maneuvers correctly, allowing the cannons to fire. Mehmed Khan, the commander of the left flank of the Safavid army, pushed his soldiers into the arms of cannon fire, yelling at them to charge into the Ottoman cannons. However, during this, he fell from his horse with the blow of an Ottoman spear and died. Malkoch Oğlu Ali Bey and Malkoch Oğlu II Ali Bey marched against Ismail Shah. However, both were slain. Only Ali Bey was able to shoot at Ismail with a double-barrel pistol that Yavuz had gifted him and injured him in the right arm and calf. The battle lasted for a full day, and Ismail Shah, who realized that he would be defeated, sent the last forces in his hands against the Ottoman army. The battle lasted for a full day. Shah Ismail, who realized the turn of events and that the battle was not in his favor, sent the last remaining forces in his hands against the Ottoman army. He was able to escape the field of battle with his groom, who then he changed clothes with. His groom, Atchekin Huzur, came back to the field, proclaiming himself to be the Shah, and was taken prisoner by the Ottomans. Shah Ismail was able to escape. When the Safavid army began to disintegrate, at the end of the war, Shah Ismail left the battlefield and retreated to Dergezin. Many of the famous Qızılbaş chiefs, such as Muhammad Khan, Pir Umar Bey, Qasr Hamza, Lala Hussein Bey, died in the battle. Yavuz Sultan Selim thought that the withdrawal of the first Safavid army was a fraud, but with it was understood that the war was won. He gave his army permission to plunder, and most of the captured prisoners were killed. The Ottoman army used the latest technology in this war and achieved a great victory. Selim I, who won the battle, entered Tabriz, the capital of the Safavid state, on September 6, 1514, at the head of the Ottoman army. Selim I wanted to spend the winter here, but when the unrest among the Ottoman soldiers increased due to fatigue, he had to return to Istanbul. The Safavids took back the lands they had lost, except for eastern Anatolia, without a war. The purpose of this war was not to take land, but to bring an end to the power struggle between the Safavids and the Ottomans. At the end of this war, the tribes and principalities in eastern Anatolia were reported that they were attached to the Ottoman Empire. Again, with this war, the Safavids were cut off from the allies in Egypt, with Suleiman using this conflict with the Safavids to invade Egypt under the pretext of them being heathens and supporters of Ismail. This facilitated Selim I's expedition into Egypt. In addition, the Ottoman Empire took control of the Van Tabriz line of the Silk Road, vastly enriching them. This brings an end to this video on the Ottoman war between the Safavid Empire and its leader, the Ismail Shah. If you like this video, please subscribe, comment down below for any areas you think